This is Susie from Trauma Informed Parent. I am so grateful to have with me today pediatrician Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. She is the first ever Surgeon General of California and author of the phenomenal book, The Deepest Well, Healing the Long-Term Effects of Childhood Adversity. And many followers of Trauma Informed Parent, I know, have already seen Dr. Burke Harris's phenomenal TED Talk, How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across a Lifetime. But for those who haven't, I urge you to watch it. It gives a fascinating overview of ACEs and how trauma is stored in our bodies. So welcome, Dr. Burke Harris.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to jump right to it. I've seen so much information out there about how to help children deal with the anxiety and fears that come up because of this pandemic, but I haven't seen a lot specifically geared towards children who have endured trauma and ACEs. In fact, a woman yesterday posted that she's a foster parent and that she had specifically asked for school-age children so they could be at school while she worked at her high-pressure job. And she said the emotional difficulties they're having are daunting. Are there specific differences, behavioral or physically, that children who have endured trauma might exhibit now? And if so, what can caregivers do to help, or conversely not, on the other hand, not help? What can they do?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think it's really important to keep in mind is that kids who have experienced trauma may also be sensitized to subsequent stressors, right? So I think most of us, everyone recognizes that we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's a pretty stressful time. And I think that, so most of us recognize that, and we see that different folks have different reactions. But we recognize that kids who have experienced trauma really represent a special population right now, who may be, number one, more easily triggered, but number two, may have a greater stress response, right? Even to the same level of a stressor, right?
Yes.
Because that's what we learn. We understand that the way our stress response system works is that when we've experienced high doses of cumulative adversity, or when we've experienced intense or severe adversity, that can affect the way our stress response functions, so that we have a greater stress response with a similar trigger. And so that's something to keep in mind if you're like, wow, my kids seem to be really, really struggling right now. It's not just because, it's not just all in their head. It's not just because they're taking it personally, but it could be because they're biologically more sensitive to the experience of the stressors that are happening right now.
How do we help them feel like they have more agency, more control?
Yeah, so one of the things that you've probably heard folks talking about, one of the things I've learned from my mental health colleagues is this concept of co-regulation, right? One of the most important things that we can do for the young folks in our lives who have experienced trauma is number one, just being that caring, kind of reflective place, and managing our own stress, right? And modeling some of that self-care and self-regulation that's so important. Yeah. But then number two, acknowledging, right? So one of the things that I heard over and over and over again when I was caring for kids who had experienced trauma and adversity was that when they had a reaction to an event that seemed like maybe not that severe an event, right? Either they would feel blamed by other people, or they would blame themselves. And it's really important to say, you know what, because of what you've experienced, your body may be making more stress hormones than the average person, right? And that can look and feel like, oh, you're having trouble sleeping, you're having difficulty focusing on tasks, or difficulty, paying attention and learning, or you're just struggling with your self-regulation. you know what, that's normal because of what you've been through,
Well, that's
right?
empowering in and of itself, because we don't often say, let's get this out of your head and then look at what your body is doing. And that in itself is education, which I would think is somewhat empowering.
That's right. And in fact, one of the things that the response that I get most often when I explain that is, oh, you mean I'm not crazy? And it's like, you're certainly not. This is actually, your body has a mechanism that's designed to protect you from harm. And because you've been through harm, that mechanism in your body is even stronger, right? And so that's what you're feeling and experiencing right now.
Thank you. That is very helpful. Speaking of adult self-care, I noticed that posts that address how adults are deeply struggling right now are very, very popular. And I wanted to share with you one comment that a woman had made. She is a working mom, and she's also in a doctor training program. And she wrote, "When I received the news that our schools would close for the remainder of the year, my heart sank. I cried myself to sleep last night for fear of, how am I going to do this? I have some friends in the same boat, but they don't have answers either." And people have commented they don't have a lot of time or energy to read lengthy articles or watch long talks about how to help. Can you offer any concise suggestions for parents who are really struggling right now, and especially parents who may have a history of trauma where they're finding that re-triggered?
One of the things about this experience is that, especially for adults or anyone who's had a history of trauma, there are many ways in which the dynamics are similar. There's something really big and pretty bad that's happening right now, and we don't have control over it, right? And that lack of control it triggers a lot of those feelings that individuals experienced during trauma that they've had in the past. And so some of the pieces is just like recognizing and acknowledging, oh my goodness, this is what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? I really don't have control over this whole big picture, but I'm gonna focus on, so let me take a moment to focus on the things that I can control, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that feeling of uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen next, and feeling out of control is a really big part of contributing to going from something being stressful to being traumatic, right?
Yes.
And so focusing on the things that we can control, and sometimes they can be tiny. Like sometimes it's just, we're going to take it one day at a time, right? It's like sometimes it's like, I'm just going to focus on my breath right now. Like I'm just going to focus on breathing, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to focus on doing the things that I can for my family. I'm going to focus on, you know what, for today, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to walk for 30 minutes today, and that's what I'm going to do for me as part of my self-care and my healing.
It's incredible, right? How something so simple can actually offer such help.
Yeah. Or just, they breaking it down into little concrete things. Like today I'm going to call, reach out to a girlfriend and kind of share, or just maintaining those social connections. And a couple of the things that we know that I talk about in the deepest well, but it's good to kind of go back, because one of the pieces that I find to be really helpful is a recognition of like, oh, my body is actually making more stress hormones right now. Mm-hmm. And the things that make a difference to reduce those stress hormones are things like, regular exercise, right? Like so that's going to help me bring down those stress hormones. That's one thing that's going to help me feel better. Nutrition, right? Even though I don't want to, and in fact, I think many people kind of laugh when I say this. They laugh with recognition. So many of us, what we want right now is just to tunnel our way to the bottom of that bag of potato chips, right? Yeah. Like we're having more cravings.
Yes.
And it's actually, that's cortisol. Like cortisol triggers us to crave high sugar, high fat foods. So things like, getting that good nutrition with lots of fruits and veggies and, lean protein and omega-3 fatty acids, nuts and all of that kind of stuff. That's part of the healing process that helps our bodies feel better. But honestly, the one piece that I want to say is really important right now is that if you've ever in the past worked with a mental health professional or thought of reaching out to a mental health professional, there's never been a better time. Most people have changed to telemedicine so you can have your visits by phone call or by Skype. And that's a really important part of, getting through this time.
Yes, thank you for saying that, because I think a lot of parents are at their wits' end. And I saw your interview with Angelina Jolie, which was wonderful. And you had mentioned, and I'm glad you talked about how verbal and emotional abuse, or when it gets, severe, or parents are raging, is actually equally as damaging biologically as physical abuse. Because I think some people think, well, at least I'm not hitting. And I'm so glad you made that point, because if a parent knows that, at least they will also consider that a reason to reach out for help.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
What about teenagers? I'm just wondering, are you have any insight into how a parent, especially a foster parent maybe, who might have some teenagers who are struggling?
Yeah. So now is a really hard time for teenagers because they are not out with their friends, right? And a lot of the times, if anyone out there with teenagers is like my household with teenagers, my husband and I have 4 boys, and we have twin 17-year-olds, and they kind of disappear into their bedrooms, right? And they maybe come out to eat, right? To forage. And it can be really challenging, because when you're sheltering in place with your teenagers, and especially if they have a history of trauma, especially if they are finding that they're really struggling with their mood, or they're more irritable, or they're really, any of those pieces, you may notice that there's more conflict happening, or they're pushing back more, right?
Yes.
Because they're also dealing with this sense of powerlessness, right? Again, kind of reconnecting into focusing on the things that we can control, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then once again, I think one piece that's important is a lot of teenagers now, they connect with their friends via social media, or if they have, a smartphone or something along those lines. But the trick there is that we have to check in with them about how they're doing with the consumption of social media, because just as the 24/7 news cycle wears us out, and you have to kind of have a news diet sometimes, right? To limit that, especially when the information is distressing. I think the same, checking in with your teenager about how much media they're consuming, what they're, and then making sure that they're staying connected to their sources of support.
Definitely.
Whether that's their friends, whether it's their coach, whoever that is, but trying to facilitate that and get those teenagers to do some exercise. Speaking from experience, but really, I mean, even if it's like going for a bike ride around the block or something like that can really make a difference.
With sheltering in place, I remember you said with the interview that sheltering in place is great if you are home and safe. But I know that reports of abuse are down, which isn't necessarily a good thing, because a lot of those reports come from teachers and coaches and priests and rabbis. And what can somebody do if they know somebody they know is in trouble, or a neighbor's in trouble? Or what can we do to help people that we know may have this issue, or they're not sheltering safely in place?
Yeah. So number one, we recognize there is a shelter in place order, but for anyone who is in an environment that is not safe, it is 100% okay to leave to get help. I just want to make sure that people feel really clear on that, especially if there's household violence, intimate partner violence, child maltreatment. It is 100% okay to leave to get help.
Thank you.
The other piece of it for all the rest of us, right, is to check in. I think that sometimes you really don't know when there's family violence happening, but sometimes, you know, friends and family members have a sense of who they're concerned about, right? And
Yeah.
and oftentimes it can be, even if there's like a text signal or a code word or something that can indicate, hey, I need help. Can you send help? Can you, you know, whatever it is, so that we're you know, having those bridges of connection to resources and services. And even if there is not physical violence or, you know, verbal violence that's happening at home, but there's still just concerns about vulnerable households, it's still really important for all of us to check in.
Yes.
In California, I know that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, has resources on their website. In California, we have a website, covid19.ca.gov, and anyone can go on it. You don't have to be from California to go there. But we've listed all of the national hotlines for, you know, for intimate partner violence, the suicide hotline, the teen hotline, the, you know, just so resources for lots of different folks around if you're struggling, if you're in trouble. And the other piece that I think is really important, especially for adults who have had a history of trauma, is that we often think about, we recognize that that adults who have had a history of trauma are at greater risk of having a mental health or a physical or behavioral consequence.
Yep.
But we also, you know, may be more likely, right, to lash out verbally.
Yes.
Right? To have more difficulty controlling our impulses,
yes.
Right? Both, especially when we're feeling overwhelmed. And so we're dealing with all the stress, and then you have the economic stress on top of that. And then you have these kids at home on top of that. And if you are a parent with a history of trauma yourself, that can be enough to push you over the edge. And what I want to encourage people is any of those hotlines, the parent talk hotline, the disaster helpline, the you know, call, right? Better to call and have, you know, talk it down, talk it out, and get some resources so that you can be safe for yourself and for your family.
Absolutely. Thank you. One last question. Long-term impact. How do you see kids, how do you see this playing out in the long term, as when it's finally over, years down the road?
Yeah. So I think that what we're going to see is kind of a spectrum, right? So we know that because our entire community is dealing with this, our entire world is dealing with this major stressor, right?
Yep.
That for those who are more vulnerable, there's a greater risk of having stress-related health and mental health consequences, and we're, you know, we're already seeing that, right? But at the same time, I think there's an opportunity for a growth. There's an opportunity for us to build the muscles of resilience, right? And to practice. I think we're getting a greater sense now that we're all connected.
Definitely.
Right? Like we're really understanding.
Yeah, you didn't get that before, I think.
Yeah, exactly. That we're all connected, and so my hope is that by having these conversations, by putting it out there and getting, you know, talking about it, talking about the supports and talking about the resources, that we can kind of swing that pendulum more towards the growth and the development and the strength and the resilience, and you know, less in the harmful impacts.
That's lovely. I hope so. Thank you, Dr. Burke Harris, so much for being with me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. It is a joy to talk to you. Thank you for the work that you do every day. And please stay safe, be well.
Back at you. You too.